In 1958, a quiet college student from Kansas shocked the nation with a crime so calculated it defied belief. This is the story of a boy no one truly knew. Watch the full video over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, linked down below. Now enjoy the stories. I hail from England, somewhere up north that I'll keep to myself, but this one took place in Yorkshire, at Howstein Gorge, if there's any chance at all that you've been there. Not sure if the Let's Read crew has ever taken a work jolly to the UK, but if you ever do, then I highly recommend Howstein Gorge. As the name might suggest, it's a gorge, a valley. It's made of limestone, and Wikipedia tells me it forms a unit of the Upper Nidderdale Site of Special Scientific Interest, which sounds both special and scientific. It's a tourist attraction, and there's a cave there called the Tom Taylor Cave. This is meant to be named after some highwaymen, and if I'd been paying attention on the school trip, I'm sure that I'd know why it's named after him. I also remember that there's some Narnia-based stuff there too, and a statue of Aslan the lion. They do school trips there, so there's a cafe, an activity center, and all sorts of stuff. It's a great place for wee kids to go, and I was in year 7 when I went with my school. Our geography teacher, Mr. Fisher, was the one who led the trip. It was 2012, I think, the good old days. It was just a small group of us, and it was an extracurricular trip that we had to pay to go on, so it was on a Sunday. We'd learned about caves and stuff in geography, and some of us had expressed an interest in the gorge, so Mr. Fisher had arranged the trip, and we were also accompanied by another teacher, a female PE teacher called Mrs. Jones. Mr. Fisher was a no-nonsense lad, a classic big man with a booming voice and a bushy beard. But that day he was acting proper strange, to say the least. Right from the start of the day, kids were whispering and nudging each other because Mr. Fisher kept jumping, like he was receiving a mild fright or electric shock whenever anyone spoke to him, or later even looked at him. Even as wee little shites, we were observant enough to notice it. Fisher was probably sketched out about, well, anyone and everyone. We'd be wandering around the gorge, looking at rocks and streams and stuff, and if another visitor came along, Fisher would act all weird and strange. It was like he thought everyone we encountered was some kind of wrong'un who was there to snatch us kids away. It's normal for a teacher to be a bit overprotective, but this wasn't normal at all. He'd even act like we should keep away from this group of other kids we saw at one point from another school. Just very strange. We'd been split into 2 groups, and Mrs. Jones had the other group. I was in Fisher's group, and me and a couple of mates appointed ourselves as Fisher's guardians, I guess. We were weird little spots, but what can I say? So we were patrolling around, play acting like we were protecting our teacher from this imaginary threat, and it was kind of silly and fun. Fisher clearly picked up on it because he took us 3 aside while the class was collecting rock samples from that gorge or something, and we couldn't tell if he was having a laugh or not, but he thanked us for being diligent and said he appreciated our efforts. Of course, this made us feel right smug, so we probably didn't question it as much as we should have when Fisher said the next thing. There was this kid on the trip, we'll just call him Jason, and he was, well, actually, there's not really anything interesting to say about Jason. He was just a completely normal lad, not one of our friends, but not any kind of villain or school bully or really anything. But Fisher asked us to keep an eye on Jason, because he was, quote, up to something. One of us asked Fisher what he meant, and he looked very serious and grave, and he said that he couldn't tell us, but they had sent Jason on the trip. He then started ranting about them for a bit and even pointed out some old granddad up on the cliff path who Fisher claimed was a lookout for them. Then he said the word that would come to hang over our whole school trip to the Howstein Gorge. Fisher told us that he was a victim of gang stalking. Of course, we never heard of this before, back in 2012 as youngins, but Fisher had. He told us that as his trusted lieutenants, it was okay for him to tell us. But for a while now, he'd been the victim of gang stalkers, an organized group of people who targeted and stalked individuals for unknown reasons. Of course, being stupid, I asked what those unknown reasons were, and Fisher did his usual thing of heartily and jovially mocking one of us for being dumb, which I guess is kinda why we didn't take anything too seriously. He was probably joking about this gang stalking malarkey, and we'd never heard the term before, so of course, how were we supposed to know that this was a growing conspiracy theory? Of course, these days I've done a hell of a lot of research into gang stalking, persecuted individuals, and things like that, and you understand why I wanted to grasp what happened that day when I tell you. Now back then, though, we just thought that Fisher was having a bit of fun with us, and oh boy were we clueless idiots, let me tell you. We had a packed itinerary for that day. Halstein Gorge has this activity center and canoeing and a whole bunch of other stuff that I won't list in case this ends up reading like a stealth ad for the place. I don't work there, I promise. I just had the scariest time of my life there, though. Anyways, Mrs. Jones' group were doing stuff at the activity center, so that meant Mr. Fisher's group was doing the tour through Tom Taylor Cave. I say tour because that's what we were promised when we paid for the school trip. When we arrived at the cave, though, Mr. Fisher announced that we wouldn't be waiting for the tour guide and he'd take us in and show us around. Fisher was still acting dead weird, though, and me and my mates thought that that was great, until we didn't. He kept pulling us aside, whispering to keep an eye on this or that member of the public who we passed. Now at first, again, it seemed like our teacher was having some harmless fun. You're not meant to suspect that the adult in charge of you is unfit to look after you. And then, he started saying some really violent, disturbing stuff. He pointed Jason out again and said that if we saw him acting up, we were authorized to use deadly force. We laughed this off, but he got really serious and told us that he hadn't wanted to scare us, but he'd noticed that at least one of us was a targeted individual too, and that we needed to be vigilant. He said that as our teacher, he was giving us permission to respond with reasonable violence, and that if we had to go on the run after this, he'd make sure to protect us. It was all a bit intense and scary from that point, and even as young kids, we were mature enough to realize that this was very wrong and shouldn't be happening. We discussed it amongst ourselves. Is Fisher really a mental case? Is this a joke we're not understanding, etc.? One of the guys was adamant that it was all a big prank, but we shut him down pretty quickly. There was no way our teacher would take things remotely this far. He'd been telling us that we could stomp Jason's face in, for God's sakes. Anyway, Fisher took the discussion away from us eventually by acting so mental that even the most skeptical among us were forced to take it seriously. We were following him through the cave system. He'd basically given up actually teaching the class at this point, and we were all following in just confused silence. Jason had no idea that Fisher even suspected him of being a gang stalker or whatever, and he seemed to be having a good time with his pals. Why wouldn't he be? He was an 11-year-old kid just like the rest of us. Thankfully, it wasn't Jason that eventually triggered Fisher into action. Honestly, if it had been, I'm not convinced that things would have been okay. Not that they were really okay anyway, but at least he didn't curb stomp a kid or anything. What he did instead was spot a woman in the caves who was wearing sunglasses. She was up ahead, and for some reason she had dark glasses on in the caves. We think looking back that she was probably nearsighted or had some kind of light sensitivity condition, or maybe she just had those glasses that react to light and the floodlights in the caves cause them to tint over. Either way, Fisher stopped the entire group and told us all to crowd into this alcove we were near. It's the one with the plaque that talks about mining, I think, if you've ever been there. So the whole group was crowded into the small alcove deep in a cave, and Fisher came over to me and the boys and said something like, "Hey lads, look at her. She's one of them." He explained that you could tell because she was wearing dark glasses indoors, and I remember getting really hung up on that. Like, does being in a cave count as indoors or outdoors? Still never decided on the actual answer. That's not the point though. The point is that Fisher told us the woman was watching us. Next, he said she radioed up to the surface to alert helicopters so they could track us when we emerged. He was absolutely adamant that she was some kind of agent of this gang stalking, and the poor old dear's sunglasses were the clue. He also pointed out that it was super suspicious that she had some kind of rain poncho thing covering her hair. Why this was suspicious, I don't really know, but Fisher seemed to think it was. Of course, it was just because she probably had a perm or something. She was an old lady, and we were in a damp, dank cave with water dripping from the ceiling. A bunch of people had head coverings, but Fisher decided this older lady was the root of all evil, with plans to snatch up the kids in his care to frame him or something. He was just going absolutely off on one of these gang stalkers and then pleading with us to support his innocence if anything went wrong. We were just kind of taken aback because things had gone from one to crazy in a matter of seconds. I guess Fisher could tell we were unsure because he suddenly got pretty angry at us and stormed off towards the lady. We all gave each other a look and our hearts sank. What was he going to do? Well, it turns out he grabbed her and started shaking her. Now we got closer and could hear him asking about her people on the surface and what her plans were. The old lady looked completely horrified and terrified, and to this day I'm convinced she genuinely thought that she'd done something wrong and Fisher was the law and she was in a lot of trouble. And then a bloke came over who clearly overheard everything and realized Fisher was losing it. He told him to let go of the lady. I don't think they knew each other or anything, but he was just sort of a good Samaritan, and to step away or he'd call the cops. Fisher started laughing at this, saying he wanted him to call the cops because there was no way the gang stalkers would reveal themselves. When Fisher said the word gang stalkers, maybe it's my imagination, but I think the guy knew what he was talking about because he suddenly got a bit more sympathetic and gentle with Mr. Fisher. Looking back now, I guess he watched one of those documentary series about persecuted individuals and recognized the pattern of behavior in Fisher, which of course we didn't see as little kids. So the guy was suddenly acting all kid gloves, trying to gently guide Fisher away from the older lady and back towards us. Then he looked at us, realized we were an entire school trip, and must have suddenly realized how effed up it was that this teacher, having some kind of mental breakdown about gang stalking, was in charge of a whole group of kids. And that's when this fella made his big mistake. He told Fisher he was going to guide us kids back to the surface and that he'd sort everything out. Of course, you see where Mr. Fisher's mind went, right? This guy who'd come along, he was a gang stalker too, and now he was going to mask off to take his kids away from him. So in his head, Fisher was trying to be a hero when he did what he did next, and I'll argue that to this day. Fisher grabbed the guy and slammed him against the railing in the cave. Then when he crumbled to the walkway, he began kicking and stomping on him. And it was one of the most bloody, horrible things I'd ever seen. Even though I don't think Fisher did any real damage to the guy overall, it was just the feeling of helplessness that us kids had. Some of the girls were screaming and crying. I'm sure some of the guys were too. Immediately, we weren't bold, tough 11-year-olds anymore. We were little kids trapped underground in a cave with a man we were supposed to trust, who was beating the ever-living hell out of a stranger. Thankfully, the cave had a whole bunch of visitors that day, and people piled in to pull Fisher off the guy almost immediately. Like I said, I don't think any real damage was caused, and I know Fisher, somewhere in his addled mind, thought that he was saving us. And the next part of the day was understandably chaos. Us kids were just left stranded there while some members of the public, and I think an employee or two of the site, frog-marched our teacher away somewhere or another. And then some very kind Samaritans took the rest of us back out of the caves and tried to corral us into some degree of calm while asking the more sensible kids among us where our other teachers were. Ironically, it was Jason who ended up guiding someone to Mrs. Jones's group. Except at this point, we discovered they were out in the middle of the damn lake, canoeing, so we had to wait for them to eventually come to shore before Mrs. Jones could find out what had gone on. Eventually, they hailed her in, and someone explained to her while we were watching from a distance, worried sick about Fisher, and if he was going to go to prison, and if we were somehow going to get in trouble for entertaining his delusions. And I think part of us genuinely wondered if there really was some sinister group persecuting Fisher. Like I said, when an adult you trust tells you these things, as a kid, you believe it. But there were no gangs stalking agents, no helicopters, nobody coming to snatch us, so we started swaying more and more towards Fisher has gone mental, which, I add, made us pretty sad because we actually liked the guy. Eventually, a couple of other teachers and some of the parents arrived at the site, and we all eventually transported home in the coach that had brought us. There was a distinct lack of Mr. Fisher, and everyone was excitedly whispering to Mrs. Jones's group about what had happened. The other group were understandably miffed that they'd missed all the excitement, so kids were gossiping about it and telling all sorts of stupid stories. Fisher had killed the guy. Fisher punched a guy's head clean off. Fisher tried to murder a granny. Fisher was wanted by the FBI, and all sorts of stuff like that. Me and the boys started getting a bit cross with people telling them that no, Mr. Fisher must have had a heat stroke or some kind of head illness, and it wasn't right to go talking crap about him. And to this day, I'm proud of me and the lads for sticking up for him. I never saw that guy again. He never came back to the school, obviously, and from what I understand, he mentally declined pretty severely after that and ended up in a home. I only got to hear about it through gossip at the school and was never really able to verify things, so I'm not sure how true any of this is, but the story went that he had some kind of early onset Alzheimer's and had picked up the gang-stalking delusion as a sort of fixation for whatever reason, and it had come to dominate his life. The talk at the school was that he'd mentioned gang-stalking to other older students in the past, so it wasn't a totally new thing, just something we hadn't heard about. Like I said, though, no idea if this was true or just kids embellishing. Either way, though, Fisher had a serious mental break that in my eyes at least was impossible to predict. It was sad as hell, and I thank God every day that things weren't much worse than that day for all of us, but I guess either way, normal life was over for Fisher. That's the part of the story that terrifies me so much, honestly. Not hearing our teachers say those violent things or seeing him attack people. It's the idea that one day, your own brain can turn on you like that. It can start telling you that people are out to get you, make you feel persecuted and targeted, and then put patterns together to reinforce that. I looked into Fisher's eyes that day as he was telling us about the gang stalkers who were pursuing him, and I would swear hand on heart that he believed everything he was telling us. And clearly it wasn't real. There wasn't a sinister group out there stalking our teacher with the intent of stealing us kids away from him on a school trip. So the fact his brain could turn on him so badly in order for him to believe all this, that's the part that sometimes keeps me awake at night. When me and my buddy Craig were younger, we did a terrible thing. Names changed to protect the not-so-innocent, etc. I'm gonna say at the start here, TLDR, y'all have every right to hate me for this. The amount of guilt I feel is a lot, and I can't even turn myself in and get punished for it because I already did at the time, and it was treated like we were just kids and it wasn't really our fault. Maybe that's true, but I can't accept it. I ruined a guy's life, possibly forever for all I know, and I did it by using his absolute worst fear in the world. I didn't know it was his worst fear at the time. How could I? Not many real people are deathly afraid of mummies. And I have to wonder why he volunteered to take us to the Egyptian exhibit at our local museum. It was a small suburban museum which didn't normally get exciting or rare exhibits, so I guess an Egyptian exhibit was a big deal. But we weren't studying Egypt in middle school, not in any real capacity. And besides, Mr. Barker was our English teacher. He wasn't our history teacher. I guess maybe I figured he was interested in ancient Egypt. So then how was I meant to know that he had a major fear of it? We arrived at the museum, just some of the members from our grade, and we were accompanied by Mr. Barker and Miss Pace, the school nurse of all people. Maybe there were other teachers present and I'm just not really remembering them correctly. I just remember our small group being guided around the Egypt exhibit by Mr. Barker, who alternated between really enthusiastic and strangely jumpy. And even then, we didn't put two and two together to work out that he was getting edgy around the two mummies that were on display. And after some time, Craig and I got bored and started to linger at the back of the group, and then wandered off together. We found some pots that the sign claimed to include the organs of a vizier, and I began teasing Craig that the vizier was going to haunt him. Next, We found a plastic crocodile and were trying to decide if the museum thought it was a real preserved crocodile when it was clearly a piece of something from Spirit Halloween. I mean, surely they had to realize. And then Craig noticed a tiny disclaimer on a sign tucked into the back of the exhibit saying that the crocodile was for illustration purposes only. Mystery solved. And then we stumbled across a gray door with a lock on the outside. It said, "Staff only," with a sign hanging on it from the door by a string. So, being the stupid kids we were, I stole it and hid it in my school bag. Now looking inside, we could see that the room was some kind of maintenance room, or more accurately, a restoration room. There were a few exhibits from the museum dotted around the room, along with tools that suggested that they were being restored. And that wasn't what caught our eye, though. At the end of the room, propped up against the wall, was an open sarcophagus. And inside was an actual mummy. The other mummies in the exhibit had been behind glass and only partially on display. This one was just sort of sitting there, out in the open. And as we crept into the room, we could see that the bandages on one side of the corpse had been peeled away and were clearly being restored. This meant that an actual part of the dead body underneath could be seen. And this was the most awesome thing that me and Craig had ever seen. We started to creep up on this mummy and studied it for a little bit. Now at the time, it didn't really strike us as weird that some priceless ancient mummy had been left exposed in an unlocked museum restoration room. You probably worked out the secret of the mummy already from this, but if not, I'll just keep quiet for now. Now our first thought was to go and get Mr. Barker to show him. We liked the guy and thought he was super cool and thought that he'd actually get a kick out of this. So we ran to find him, and as luck would have it, the class was having a break in the Egyptian exhibit and everyone was just kind of hanging around doing their own thing. We told Mr. Barker that we'd found an abandoned, cursed mummy that was falling apart in an unlocked room. Naturally, as the grown-up, he decided it was his responsibility to look into our claims. But even then I could tell that he was unsettled or disturbed about something. We led him to the storeroom, and when we got there, Craig and I decided not to go inside. I can't remember if we'd already decided on pulling some prank at this point, or maybe we'd just been spooked by the actual dead body in the room. Either way, we let Mr. Barker go in. We watched him walk up to the mummy, and then we pulled the door shut and latched it. Mr. Barker didn't notice for a minute. We watched through the small window in the door as he looked at the mummy and then strangely jumped back. Then he reached out and touched it. Then he stepped back again. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. I was watching a man who had a unique opportunity to face his own obscure fear, even though I didn't really realize that's what I was observing yet. I genuinely think he conquered it too. He very carefully and gently touched the mummy, first on the bandages and then on the actual flesh itself. Craig and I looked at each other and just gasped, making gross out sounds. Our teacher had touched a mummy. God, what was he doing? And then Mr. Barker started to turn and head for the door. We ducked out of sight, giggling when we imagined him discovering that it was actually locked. And Barker went from 1 to 100 in a fraction of a second. 1 minute he tried the door. The next, he was hammering and banging on it, screaming and yelling that he'd been trapped. Now Craig and I looked at each other and just ran. We hid and watched from some distance as Mr. Barker was banging on that door and then stopped. We were not enjoying this. We were absolutely terrified at his sudden, violent reaction and terrified at getting in a lot more trouble than we'd ever imagined. Now just remember, at this point we had no idea that this dude had an actual phobia of mummies. How could we possibly even know that? We were at an Egyptology exhibit. Why did he come? I could not swear on my family's life that the next part actually happened, but it's what both Craig and I remember happening. We hung back and watched from our vantage point as through the little window in the door, Mr. Barker disappeared back into that room. The next moment, the mummy itself came flying face first towards the tiny window, and we both swear that we heard a cry of "mother effer" coming from inside the restoration room. It was like Mr. Barker was trying to use the mummy to break down that door. Of course, to us, this meant that we'd driven our teacher to madness and caused him to destroy a priceless Egyptian artifact. The amount of trouble we were going to get into at that moment was unparalleled. And there was nothing for it. We had to stay hidden and never let anyone know that it was us who'd locked that door. Craig and I argued for a moment over which one of us would go and get the museum staff. Craig insisted that if we did, we'd be under suspicion, and besides, Mr. Barker was making so much noise that someone was eventually going to hear any minute now. And it took almost 10 minutes. 10 minutes of Mr. Barker bashing and crashing around with a mummy and then going silent for some time towards the end. Eventually, a couple of the museum staff came running to that restoration room. They unlatched the door, and we watched with horror as they stepped inside. There were torn bits of bandages and broken bits of that mummy all over the room. Mr. Barker had completely destroyed that thing like he'd gotten into a fight with it. And then Barker had laid it back into the sarcophagus and just sort of trembled there, burnt out and completely spent. The museum staff were just sort of staring around in absolute horror. And remember, Craig and I thought that Barker had destroyed a priceless Egyptian mummy. Craig whispered to me that Barker might actually go to jail for this, and that the criminal damage and charges might be insane. And that was it for me. I ran out of our hiding place, yelling how it had been us. We locked him inside, and it wasn't his fault that he'd smashed up that thing. And the museum staff reacted strangely. They didn't start yelling for armed cops to come and take us away like we thought was going to happen. They told us to calm down, and we go to the director's office and figure this all out. I think that was supposed to reassure me, but instead, what happened next only served to just terrify Craig and I even more. One of the museum staff guided Mr. Barker out of the room. He walked out on these very shaky legs, took one look at me, and then just doubles over and begins to vomit. Only it wasn't just regular vomit. To me, it looked like he was puking up this black liquid, like the actual mummy's curse was real, and I'd caused it to hit my teacher hard. So Mr. Barker was there, throwing up, eyes locked into mine, and for all the world, it looked like he was just puking hell itself up. Honestly, in that moment, I've never been more scared. I wasn't the kind of kid who believed in the supernatural, but if anything was going to make me a believer, it was that, and in that moment right there. I guess one of the museum's staff saw that we were looking with complete horror because she actually put her arm around me and told me it was probably going to be okay. She said it was just mummy dust, and that our teacher had inhaled it because he'd been around a mummy without ventilation and a mask like he should have been. Been around a mummy was putting that very mildly. The dude had legitimately manhandled and destroyed a corpse. And honestly, Mr. Baker inhaled a mummy wasn't actually any less scary to think about than a legitimate mummy's curse. I guess the only thing that even made it slightly more tolerable and shifted it from unspeakable nightmare fuel to a somewhat creepy incident was the later explanation we heard for everything. And so here's what went down. Pretty much the entire Egyptian exhibit, their big deal event that they were selling tickets to and getting schools to pay for, was replicas only. They had a few disclaimer signs on the more obvious fakes, like the Spirit Halloween crocodile, but much of it was being passed off as real. So Mr. Baker didn't destroy a priceless mummy, but instead destroyed a fake mummy. However, it was made using a real, legally acquired corpse from the 50s. So Mr. Barker was trapped in a room with a dead body, dressed as a mummy, which he then smashed and inhaled dust from. So in terms of a crime being committed, thankfully it wasn't bad for any of us. But we had still driven our teacher crazy by locking him in with that mummy, no matter how fake the wrappings or modern the corpse was. We were so ridiculous. We'd do anything. We were so sorry. We knew we were the worst kids ever. And yet, everyone involved kept dismissing it that we didn't mean any harm and were just playing a typical schoolboy prank and had no intention of harming Mr. Barker. Now, I guess that's true, but I still felt terrible. I'm even told that Mr. Barker held no ill will towards us, but since I never directly saw him again, I can't be sure how true that actually was. Even mine and Craig's parents were pretty soft on us. They almost acted like we were victims somehow. And to this day, I wonder if there was something that other people knew that we didn't, that maybe suggested Mr. Barker was dangerous or more volatile than we knew or something. I don't know. I just don't feel like we were ever punished, really. Mainly this because the museum, the school, and Mr. Barker's family decided it would be better for us to just sort of cover it up. Now, this was back in the 1980s, so there was still a lot of stigma around mental illness. Barker's career as a teacher would be severely impacted if any of this came out, so he took an extended leave of absence until the next semester, by which time Craig and I had left that school and moved on to high school. Now, we kept our word and didn't tell any of our peers about driving Mr. Barker insane with some mummy. We were pretty ashamed, and I still am even to this day, and like I said, I still feel like I should have received a harsher punishment. I have no idea how Mr. Barker is doing. I do know that he returned to teaching, but then I lost track of him in the past before there was any real internet or social media or anything, and I've never been able to remember his real name to look him up since. Craig and I still stay in touch via Facebook these days, and both still agree that we feel terrible for triggering Mr. Barker's immense phobia of mummies. This is kind of a weird one that happened to me when I was in high school in the early 2010s. So I had this boyfriend, we'll just call him Dylan, and I don't mean to brag, but he was the kind of hot that made other girls jealous. We weren't quite the school's prom king and queen power couple, but we were pretty close to it, and we were otherwise just totally normal kids having a totally normal high school time. Now, one of Dylan's electives was art, and it was one of the few classes we didn't actually have together. Our school was pretty tiny, and because we were young and LOL in love, we tried to ensure that we shared as many classes as possible. Dylan took art though, and I didn't, so I had band when he had his art lessons. And he was and still is a pretty great artist too, and he specializes in still life using pastels, acrylics, or charcoal. And these days does digital art, but back then in school it was those things. One day, early in our senior year, as we were walking home from school hand in hand, Dylan asked me the strangest question. "What does 'draw me like one of your French girls' mean?" Obviously, as his loving and faithful girlfriend, that made me excited. I asked him why he was asking, and if someone had said it to him. And he just sort of laughed it off and asked a bit sheepishly, and I pushed him on it. He wouldn't tell me at first, and I got a little mad at him. Now, with his usual puppy dog eyes and hapless sincerity, he asked me why it was such a big deal. I just laughed and explained that scene from Titanic, you know? And I'm sure everyone knows it, but just in case you're listening and you're one of those Gen Alpha types, Kate Winslet says, "Draw me like one of your French girls," and it means, "draw me nude." So if someone had asked my boyfriend to draw me like one of your French girls, then it was either one of his football buddies and he was about to get a rude awakening, or it was someone who I didn't want him drawing like a French girl. And when he told me who'd said it to him, I was a bit floored. Dylan claimed that it was his art teacher, Miss McElroy, and she had said it jokingly to him after class while he was packing up. I started asking if anyone else had been there, and he said no, it was just him. He said she must have just been kidding though, that no way there was a teacher offering to pose nude for a student, and I started to grill him again. To me, it really didn't sound like she was joking. We ended up having a little argument about it, and I went home that night seething about Miss McElroy. Now let me explain. Miss McElroy was new to the school for that school year. She was young, dark-haired and pretty, with a stunning skin and a European accent that might actually have been French. Now all the guys at school had a crush on her, and so did some of the girls, and the rest of us were just sort of low-key a little jealous of how glamorous and how this new teacher was. So we're not talking some hairy-legged, cardigan-wearing old lady art teacher here. It was a woman who was less than 10 years older than my boyfriend, who, based on my observations, was kind of flirty. I didn't want to piss Dylan off, but I'd ask about Miss McElroy after that. Just sort of casual. How was art today? Miss McElroy offered a strip for you again yet? Painted that teacher yet? Jokes like that which were kind of not jokes. Now Dylan surprisingly didn't get annoyed with me about it, and that's maybe why I kept it up. In fact, he'd reply in the negative, of course, nothing was happening, but he seemed almost uncomfortable and sort of cagey, like there was something he wanted to tell me but didn't know how. I started making sure to arrange things so I could meet Dylan after his art classes. The period where I had band and he had art was the best one because I was able to skip out on that class early a bunch of times. Now one day I showed up to the art class early, but the rest of the class had already been dismissed. The interior windows of the art class had always been frosted glass, so it was impossible to spy into the classroom by looking through them. This time, the door was ajar though, so I kind of eavesdropped. Miss McElroy was talking to Dylan, complimenting his art, and maybe it was just my imagination, but there was definitely a flirty tone to her voice. Then, my blood ran cold when I heard her ask Dylan if he'd given any thought to her request for a portrait commission out of hours. Dylan stuttered and stammered and said he'd work something out, and that's when I knew the kind of portrait she meant. Dylan brought it up himself later when we were hanging out in the park with the two of our buddies. Now he swore us all to secrecy and then told us that Miss McElroy was trying to commission him to paint a nude portrait of her at her home. He also confessed that he'd been deeply uncomfortable with how she'd behaved towards him, and that she'd made a few more advances that he interpreted as solicitous. Not the word he used back then, obviously. Now I was horrified, obviously, but our two dumbass buddies, both guys, were kinda like, "You go, bro. Get that cougar pee." And then they remembered that I was there and apologized and shut up, but you could tell that they didn't take it seriously at all. Now I reminded them that Dylan was 17, and that crime was a crime. A teacher can't behave like that towards a student, and besides, Dylan was uncomfortable. He seemed relieved that I had his back and grateful that I understood, and later we talked about how people really do not take it seriously when it's a guy being preyed on, whether by a woman or often even another older man. And to this day, I still insist that we as a society do not take male victims as seriously as we should. It's something that Dylan and I have always advocated for over the years, and yes, spoiler, we're still together to this day and married with a beautiful daughter and another on the way. Now, Dylan kept me filled in on Miss McElroy, and she was definitely rizzing him up, as the kids say these days. She kept insinuating that she really wanted him to paint her nude, and that afterwards they could see what happens. Dylan said that she then kept adding that she meant artistically, but it was very obvious that she meant some kind of physical interaction between them. Now one day I was late to getting out of class, and Dylan was supposed to meet me out at the front of the school to walk home, but when I eventually got there, he was nowhere to be seen. I knew that he wouldn't have left without me and had art as the final class of the day, so I walked back inside to see if he was still there. And the halls were almost completely deserted by then, and I realized that I was in fact very late. And when I got to the art classroom and tried the door, it was locked up. The light in the classroom was on though, and I could hear the sounds of someone inside. Now the next thing I know, my phone starts buzzing. I look down at the text and it's Dylan. "I'm in art class and McElroy is stripping," he said. "Then, she has her top off, help." I froze. I had no idea what to do. And that's when I saw the vice principal approaching down the corridor of the hallway, and maybe he could help. Now I tried to get something out, but I was actually shaking, panicking like an absolute idiot. And then my cell phone was buzzing in my hand, and I could vaguely see Dylan asking for help over and over. And I made a decision in the spur of the moment. I blurted out that I thought that there was a fire in the classroom, and then before the vice principal could react, I grabbed the fire extinguisher from on the wall and slammed it into one of the frosted glass windows. I hoped that Dylan or Miss McElroy weren't under that glass, though. Thankfully, they weren't, and the window broke apart into 3 large pieces, which fell into the classroom and shattered into tiny pieces that the safety glass tends to break into. This left a huge gaping look at what was going on inside. Miss McElroy had Dylan pinned into a seat. She was completely and totally topless, straddled across the desk, while Dylan just sat pressed back into the chair, this look of horror on his face. Now, it would have been funny if it wasn't so insanely disgusting to me. Miss McElroy looked like an actual predator, like some kind of creature advancing on my boyfriend. Now, the vice principal let out some kind of strangled cry and then began shouting at Miss McElroy to get off of that student immediately. And it was like she didn't even hear us. I'm sure it's more terrifying in my mind when I think back on it, but she was almost like a woman possessed. She was groping and grabbing at Dylan, who was sliding in his chair backwards, pinned between the teacher and the desk, his eyes wide and staring at me for help. I leaped through the waist-high broken window and did the only thing I could. I just unleashed that fire extinguisher, full foam blast at Miss McElroy. And that blast sent her falling sideways, clattering onto the ground in this mess of limbs, phone, and desks. Dylan jumped out of the way and ran over to me, and then unlatched the door from the inside and let the vice principal in. The whole thing was a bit of a chaotic poop show in our small town. Now, the way the story went, Miss McElroy had undergone some kind of drug-induced psychotic break over the semester. She had no history of acting like this with students before, but on the other hand, it was her first real posting as a teacher, so who knows if that meant anything. Now, no real criminal charges were brought against her because ultimately it didn't quite go far enough for a crime to have occurred. Yet, other than the topless part, I guess, but I have no idea. Now, Dylan and his parents were very understanding, but of course, Miss McElroy couldn't remain as a teacher, and also had to undergo mandatory psychiatric evaluation and counseling as well as some kind of rehab stint, although I'm not sure if that was a court-appointed or who forced it or anything. All I know is that my future husband came very close to being assaulted by a teacher, and even today when I tell the story, there are certain people who don't see the severity of it. No matter your gender, if you're a young person and you're being hit on by an adult, especially one in a position of authority, then you don't have to stand for it. Tell someone. Demand it to be taken seriously, and if that fails, well, then hopefully you have a loving partner who will spray them with a fire extinguisher. Anyone remember LiveJournal? It was kind of like Tumblr, but back before Tumblr was a thing. Now, there was a lot more drama-focused stuff, if you can actually believe that, and a lot less socially conscious stuff, shall we say. It had a big goth and emo population, but in general, people would just use it to microblog about their problems, their day, their faves, music, and the people they hated. And as far as I'm aware, it was the first social media blogging site. I mean, it was pretty much just exactly the same as Tumblr, but it was more oriented towards community building and having a friends list and things like that. Honestly, I was a high school kid when it was popular, in the early 2000s, so my memory on the site was a little hazy. I didn't even use it myself. It was almost like the alternative crowd, like I said, but that didn't stop LiveJournal from having a huge impact on my life, at least for around 6 months in the spring of 2004. A LiveJournal started getting shared around by some of my classmates. We were in sophomore year at high school that I won't name because I still live in that town and I actually value my anonymity. The blog had been found by one student, I'll just call her Kate, who was a big LiveJournal user. She was a real emo chick, into all the bands that people like her were into and dressed like that too, but she's kind of irrelevant to the story for the most part. She found the blog because it started following her and the title of the blog pointed to our high school. There was a post that caught her eye that she was sure was about her. It talked about a girl with her name who was a lame poser and how she'd hurt herself for attention. Now, if this was true, then Kate didn't seem to mind because she was showing the blog around like some type of badge of honor, proud that she'd attracted a quote-unquote hater. Now, a bunch of us assumed Kate had created the blog to get attention, but we'd soon find out that that wasn't the case. The next post that really caused a stir was the one that claimed Gertrude, a senior girl, not a real name either, I'm just not good with making up names, had gotten an abortion. The baby daddy was Jamal, who was not her boyfriend Dirk. Now, this led Dirk and Jamal to having some big fight in the cafeteria, with Gertrude yelling at them not to believe anonymous internet posts and hate blogs. Now, the next one accused my favorite teacher, Miss Whitaker, of running over a dog when she was a teenager. And it was just an absolutely bizarre accusation, and nobody wanted to believe that one. Nobody even wanted to mention it, but then this class idiot Blake decided to ask her about the allegedly assaulted dog, Muffy, and it clearly visibly upset Miss Whitaker. A few days later, I had a private homeroom meeting with Mrs. Whitaker and asked her about the dog. She told me that Muffy was a dog that had belonged to her friend when they were in senior year many years ago. She told me that the dog had run out in front of her car when she was driving, and she had been unable to swerve in time. It had left the dog with just 3 legs, and Mrs. Whitaker's friend blamed her for it for years. And this led to her and I having a heart-to-heart about people judging you, and I talked about an incident that happened during elementary school where my friend Dean had fallen off the jungle gym and everyone said I did it for months, and even called me a murderer despite my friend suffering just a broken arm and not actually dying. And there were a few more live journal posts after that. A few months had passed, and Abby had bulimia, Jack had erectile dysfunction, Rusha cheated on Tess, and then came my turn. And when I saw what the post was saying about me, I was absolutely floored. It asked if everyone remembered the time I pushed Dean off the jungle gym in elementary school and whether they could be safe with an attempted murderer like me around. Now, everyone kind of lost interest in the blog after that because they decided this post was just nonsense and they must have all been nonsense. Now, after all, they had no idea who Dean was or when I'd ever pushed him off a jungle gym. This is because I'd gone to elementary school not only in a totally different area, but in a different country altogether. I spent my elementary school years in Canada and then moved to the States around middle school age, and I literally never even bothered to mention the Dean falling, childish murderer rumor story to anyone because it was so silly and inconsequential. Nobody, that is, of course, except for Mrs. Whitaker. I booked another homeroom meeting with her, during which time there were a couple of more blogs accusing Kelly of being a harlot and Jim being a junkie. No, just real pathetic, childish Gossip Girl stuff. And it was before the TV show came out, but the books had been around for a couple of years at that point and were popular with some of the girls at my school, so we all thought the live journal was some student's attempt to recreate that. But how wrong we were. I didn't tell anyone about my discovery that it was Mrs. Whitaker. She was a sweet, kind, middle-aged drama teacher, and I wanted to know why she was running such a cruel blog about the students. When I asked her, her face went weirdly blank, almost terrifying. It was like something immediately broke inside her when I said in a very meek voice that I knew it was her. Miss Whitaker stared past me and then dispassionately explained that everything she'd posted about were things she'd overheard from different students. I asked her why, and she simply didn't reply. I told her I knew it was her because she was the only person that whole damn school who knew about Dean and me being accused of pushing him off the jungle gym. She actually laughed sadly at that and said, "Typical." And then she said that if I told anyone that that blog was hers, she would terminate herself, and it would be my fault. I was speechless. An adult, a teacher, my favorite teacher actually, was threatening to self-delete because of their gossip blog. This didn't happen in the real world with actual grown-up people. Except I guess it did, and that's the first time my eyes were opened to the fact that adults are just as cruel and petty and vindictive as teenagers. Mrs. Whitaker made that threat and just openly said that I would have blood on my hands. What a horrible and unpleasant thing to put upon a kid. And yet, she did. What could I do but to agree to it? And I did agree to it, but told her that I would only keep silent if she deleted that blog and never posted anything like that again. She agreed, almost carelessly, like it was no big deal. I'd genuinely never seen such a scarily dispassionate, callous side to an adult before. I didn't have free access to home internet myself, so I wasn't able to check that Mrs. Whitaker stuck to her word until the next day, when everyone was talking about how the live journal had been deleted. Nobody had seen if there had been a final post or any kind of swan song or dramatic goodbye. One minute it was there, the next minute it was gone. I asked to transfer to a different homeroom teacher, but didn't explain to anyone else why Mrs. Whitaker approved my request, of course, and she left at the end of the school year anyway. Now, to this day, I still have no idea whether or not I did the right thing by keeping Mrs. Whitaker's secret. I'm not sure what would have happened if I'd told people, but it deeply unsettles me to think of a middle-aged teacher posting those kinds of things about students. It was pathetic, childish, and completely chilling when you think about it. What possesses a grown woman who is supposed to be responsible for the care and well-being of her students to act in such a cruel manner? I wish I'd met Mrs. Whitaker again later in life so I could ask her. I've tried to find what happened to her occasionally in the subsequent years, but with no luck. I really want to meet her again and just ask her why she did it, and also get her reassurance that she never did anything else like that to anyone else, or even worse. So I grew up in America, but my dad's family is Russian. My dad grew up in the old Soviet Union with his parents and siblings, and this is a story he and my uncle have told us many times. This happened at their equivalent of middle school, which is called middle school over there. And there was this kid called Constantine, but people uncharitably knew him as Lizard Boy. Constantine had a skin condition that made him scaly and a bit deformed. I've never seen him, obviously, but when I was a kid, I used to watch the Batman animated series, so one of the times when Dad was telling us this story, I asked if Constantine looked like Killer Croc from that. Dad says he looks absolutely nothing like that at all, and that the reality of these types of skin conditions and deformities are a lot more tragic and unusual looking. I never saw Constantine, so I don't know exactly how to describe him, and Dad has too much respect for the kid to go into the details. Whenever I've asked, he just says his skin was scaly and he earned the nickname Lizard Boy. Who called him Lizard Boy, I would ask. Adults in the town, mostly violent gopniks and similar. None of the other kids called Constantine Lizard Boy, but one man who did was Boris, this local journalist with delusions of grandeur. Boris is the other important main character in this story, but we'll come to him later. Constantine was the son of a farmer. They lived hard and were dirt poor. If there was any kind of helpful treatment for Constantine in those Soviet Union days, then they didn't have access to it. Instead, he had to work the land in cold, harsh winters and blistering summers, and none of this could have been good for his illness. Now, despite the hard work, early mornings and late nights, Constantine still mostly attended school, and even though his skin deformity prevented him from people being able to speak clearly and coherently, as his lips couldn't form the words properly, he was an amiable and friendly kid who was popular with the others. He was a bit older than my dad by 2 years and was in the same grade as my uncle Vladislav. Constantine was Uncle Vladislav's friend and my dad's friend by proxy. Now, enter Boris. Boris was a former gopnik who somehow became a journalist for the local paper. The local paper was far from reputable and mostly just published garbage. Boris was dating the daughter of a gangster, though, and Boris wanted to be a journalist, so he got to write for the local paper. I don't know how much Dad and Uncle Vladislav really knew about Boris's work on the paper, or whether he did really date a nepo baby gangster. Now, this part seems highly unlikely to me, but that's how they want to tell the story, and it's how I'll tell it too. Boris kept invading school property, and it soon became clear that he was trying to dig up dirt on Constantine. He started interviewing students about the quote-unquote Lizard Boy, asking if they thought he was some kind of monster, maybe a vampire or the creature from the Black Lagoon. The teachers caught him on school property a number of times and chased him off, but he kept coming back. One day, Boris showed up with a photographer. Imagine how this wouldn't fly in the States today. A tracksuit-wearing newspaper reporter and his idiot henchman with a camera trying to snap a photo of middle school kids. This really upset Constantine and his friends. Of course, Constantine didn't want to be the subject of a newspaper story about his deformity. What kind of cruel man subjects a kid to this? Constantine just wanted to live his life in peace and make the best of his lot in life. Now enter the third main character of this story, Mr. Koslov. Mr. Koslov was one of the chemistry teachers, and he was the subject of many rumors. The main one was that he'd been an illegal bare-knuckle boxer who served in the Red Army, and this one was most likely true. He was definitely ex-armed forces and definitely a capable bare-knuckle boxer, but whether he fought in illegal underground fights, who could say? Either way, Mr. Koslov was not a man you wanted to make an enemy of, and Mr. Koslov had a protective fatherly instinct towards Konstantin. So when Boris and his crony would show up on school premises yet again, camera at the ready, Mr. Koslov was waiting for them. He grabbed the camera, not a cheap piece of equipment in the USSR back then, and smashed it on the ground. The cameraman fled immediately. Koslov got a hold of Boris, though, and roughed him up so bad he had a bleeding nose and ear. Now, a few days later, rumors were swirling around the school that Koslov had been jumped while walking home from work. Now, sure enough, when he returned to the school the next week, he'd suffered some minor injuries. The students tried asking him about it, including Konstantin himself, but Koslov wouldn't say anything, and snapped at them for asking. Everyone knew that Boris and his cronies were responsible, though. And a few weeks passed, and there were a few more attempts by Boris to photograph Konstantin. Why he was so obsessed with trying to run a newspaper story on a poor, deformed kid is anybody's guess. I, for one, think it takes a deep decay in one's soul to behave like this, but I guess that's what men like Boris are like, decayed and warped. Now one day, Dad says that Uncle Vladislav claims he overheard the teachers talking. Koslov was saying that Boris wasn't protected now, and if he came onto school property again, they were safe to deal with him. When Dad is telling the story alone, he adds that he's not sure if Uncle Vladislav really did overhear this or if he's just embellished things in the telling. Either way, Boris invaded school property one more time. Koslov and the other teachers were waiting for him. They beat him, quite severely apparently, and Boris vowed to be back and vowed that he would expose this lizard boy. And apparently, they never saw him again. Konstantin and Uncle Vladislav, then eventually my dad, moved on from that middle school and went on to high school. Konstantin and Uncle Vladislav graduated together, and my dad did so 2 years later. Unfortunately, sometime after that, Konstantin passed away due to complications from other health conditions he had. The poor boy had also had a hole in his heart and incorrectly developed internal organs. Despite his poor, simple upbringing, his funeral was standing room only. And Boris the reporter was not there. Shortly before the whole family left for the United States and a new life, a body was found in a shallow grave outside of town. And according to the report in the very paper that he'd formerly worked for, the body belonged to ex-reporter Boris. The story didn't go into too many details, but it reported that the condition of his remains suggested that his skin had been partially flayed. It could be a total coincidence. He was supposedly the ex-boyfriend of a gangster's daughter, so maybe he pissed off the wrong people, or ran into some trouble of who knows what kind of other criminal or gopnik. But Uncle Vladislav will swear to his dying day that the week after Boris first disappeared, he heard Koslov and the other teachers talking about a job well done, and saying that Konstantin wouldn't have to worry anymore. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, all links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, give 'em the old twist.